Israel's military has confirmed that the bodies of 4 more deceased hostages have been returned from Gaza as part of a U.S.-brokered peace deal.
Now, this comes as the tenuous ceasefire is tested, with Israel deciding to halve the agreed amount of aid entering Gaza, and Hamas reasserting its control over the Strip.
Yeah, officials say the bodies are in the process of being identified. They were first transferred to the Red Cross before being handed over to the IDF and the Israel Security Agency. It follows a similar transfer on Monday, where the bodies of 4 others were returned alongside all 20 living Israeli captives in exchange for the release of nearly 2,000 Palestinian prisoners.
At least 20 more deceased hostages are still in Gaza. Bereaved families seeking closure have expressed frustration over the slower-than-expected process and have accused Hamas of blatantly violating the ceasefire agreement.
48 hostages have not been brought back, and we demand of the Israeli government and we demand of everybody involved, especially the U.S. and the Arab countries that vouch this agreement, we demand them to take action.
Israel has told the UN that it would only allow 308 trucks to enter the enclave from today. And at the same time, deliveries of fuel and gas will be prohibited, with the expectations of specific needs related to humanitarian infrastructure.
The outlook on the truce also darkening, with Hamas fighters demonstrating their grip on power by executing men in the street. At least 35 people have been killed since the ceasefire took effect. President Trump has threatened to disarm the group by force if it doesn't lay down its weapons.
We have told them we want to disarm, and they will disarm. And if they don't disarm, we will disarm them. And it'll happen quickly and perhaps violently.
Let's bring back Amin Saikal, adjunct senior fellow at the Rajaratnam School of International Studies at NTU. Before we lost you earlier, you mentioned that ceasefire remains fragile due to a lack of mutual trust. And on that note, I would like to ask President Trump, who's been warning that if Hamas doesn't disarm voluntarily, the U.S. will take matters into its own hands quickly and perhaps violently. What would a forceful disarmament operation realistically look like? And how do you expect Hamas might respond to such a direct threat?
Well, Israel has been trying for the last 2 years to dismantle Hamas, and that hasn't happened entirely. I mean, there's no question that Hamas's fighting capacity has been reduced by at least 80%. But the force, the Hamas is still a force in Gaza, and during the current ceasefire, which is extremely fragile, they have been able to come out on the streets and to try to reassert their positions against certain other militias and tribal chieftains, which have been really backed by Israel. Now for President Trump to say that, we will have to really disarm Hamas if necessary by force, well, that means really the resumption of the conflict and the resumption of war. I think the best option for President Trump and for other allies in the region would be to put a lot of pressure on Hamas to abide by the terms of the peace plan. And I think the countries that can really exert more pressure on Hamas are Qatar, which is in a very, very strong position, and of course Egypt, as well as Turkey. These are the 3 countries which have also signed President Trump's plan as guarantors of that plan.
Okay, Professor, that is true, but some are also saying that, look, Hamas right now is the natural immediate authority to administer to the Strip. We know the U.S. and Israel clearly do not believe that to be the case, and they're backing local clans. I want to ask if these, clans are viable alternatives until that stabilization force is deployed, and also whether these groups are actually going to complicate talks with Hamas about disarmament, because obviously Hamas, the group, fears retribution.
I think you're absolutely right. I think that can really complicate the situation, and it could possibly result in a civil war in Gaza, because Hamas is unlikely to lay down its arms, and they've said that they're not going to do that until such time that there is a Palestinian state. And of course, that's really way down the line. I mean, that's not really going to happen overnight or for the next year or so. But for Hamas to remain insistent on that position, then and as I pointed out earlier, certain chieftains and tribal chieftains as well as militias have been supported by Israel in the past against Hamas, and that could easily lead into civil war and more conflict and more bloodshed in Gaza. And I think that is something that has to be avoided, because President Trump has said that the war is over, and I think therefore all sides will have to refrain from engaging in a type of activities which could really undermine that important assertion on the part of President Trump that the war is over. And I think that has to remain the case. But at the moment, it is very clear that Israel is on the edge about the survival of Hamas. I mean, this is something that the Israeli Prime Minister had set up as its main goal for the last 2 years, to dismantle and destroy Hamas and, of course, rescue the hostages. I mean, they haven't, despite all the operations carried out by the Israeli Defense Forces, they've not been able to free more than a dozen of hostages by use of force, and the rest of them have been released through negotiations and ceasefires. And they've not been able to dismantle Hamas altogether. Hamas still remains quite resilient and as a fighting force, although with much reduced fighting capacity.
Right. Professor, I want to ask you about the issue of aid, which we know that Israel is halving in response to the situation on the ground. A number of analysts and even some relief agencies believe, the previous looting we saw of aid convoys is down to the desperation of starving Gazans, and the problem will basically take care of itself when more aid gets through. So do you see, things that way as well? Is withholding aid the right pressure point on Hamas right now?
I doubt it very seriously. I think that could even result in the collective punishment of the Palestinians in Gaza once again. And withholding humanitarian aid has not been able to result either in freedom of the hostages in the past, or for that matter, the destruction of Hamas. But it has gravely impacted the population of Gaza, and that destitute that has really delivered to the people of Gaza. And I think it is very important that the humanitarian aids continue, irrespective of how Hamas is reacting at the moment and how Israelis are really responding to Hamas's actions. I think what is really important is that the people of Gaza must not really suffer anymore, and therefore I think it is, from my perspective, it's wrong of Israel to reduce the amount of humanitarian aid going into Gaza. And I think the international community, and more importantly, the United States, bears a major responsibility to ensure that the humanitarian aid continues to flow into Gaza, irrespective of how the situation is going to develop between Hamas and Israel. And at the same time, it is extremely important for President Trump to remain very actively engaged in the process, because his power and weight would be absolutely important in terms of producing the positive results. And once he is declared that the war is over, and I think then the focus should be precisely on that, and then the realization of that statement.
All right, Professor, we have to leave it there. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us. Amin Saikal is Adjunct Senior Fellow at the Rajaratnam School of International Studies at NTU.